This video is intended to help you get started with your evaluation of style intelligence. The video accompanies the evaluation guide, which is part of the documentation set. You can find the evaluation guide if you have the software installed on your machine by going to the Windows Start menu, selecting the Style Intelligence program group, and opening up the evaluation documentation from there. And if you do that, you'll see the documentation open up to the evaluation guide. That is the starting point of the evaluation documentation set. So you should see a page like this. If you don't have the software installed on your machine and you can't access the documentation that way, you can also find the documentation on the iNetSoft wiki, customer wiki. If you go to the product documentation page, you'll see the latest documentation available here, either in web format, HTML format, or in PDF format. And you'll also find the evaluation guide in the doc set located at this website. So you can follow along with the video, or you can follow along with the evaluation guide, or you can do both. The video will follow the evaluation guide, so what we'll be doing is covering some basic topics to help you get up and running and understand the basics of using style intelligence. And that will include, firstly, connecting to a data source, which is always the first part of getting started, connecting to your data. Then we'll talk about creating a data worksheet, which allows you to do various manipulations on your data and mash up data from different data sources. And then we'll get into creating a dashboard and creating a report. Of course, there are many other topics related to using style intelligence effectively, and you can see all of those topics in the documentation set. The purpose of this video is simply to give you a starting point, a base from which to begin your evaluation, so that you'll understand how to do the basic operations, and you can then begin to look at your own data, develop your own reports, develop your own dashboards, and have, in the course of doing that, a fruitful evaluation. In general, the first thing that you'll want to do when you're getting started is to create a connection to your data source or to multiple data sources. And you'll do that in the desktop tool called Style Studio. So let's start up Style Studio from the Windows Start menu. Go to the Windows Start menu, expand the Style Intelligence program group, and then click on the Style Studio entry, and that will open Style Studio on the desktop. Style Studio is used not only for setting up data source connections, but also for creating queries, for creating data worksheets, for creating reports, and for other purposes. So this is a tool that you will be using quite often as a developer. Before we get started setting up the connection to a data source, let's take a look at one very important configuration property for Style Studio, and that is the repository location. The repository is where Style Studio reads and writes important files from. And those files include the files that store data source information, the files that store query information, the files that store reusable report components, and so on. To set the location of the repository, you'll go to the File menu in Style Studio, select Configure, and that opens the Style Studio configuration dialog box. There are a number of things that you can set here, but I want to focus just on the Repository tab. Again, the repository is the location where Style Studio reads and writes certain key configuration files from. Now, by default, there's a single repository entry here called the default repository. The fact that it's marked with a green check mark means that this is the current working repository. That means that when you open files such as queries or data sources in Style Studio, those files are being accessed from this location. That is the current working repository. If you click on that, you'll see the information that defines that location, and the configuration directory for this default repository is in this particular location. It's in the installation folder for Style Intelligence, and the path to this location is server/webapps/sree /webinf/classes. So this is the default configuration for the default repository. Now, the significance of this location is that this is the location by default where the Style Intelligence server also looks for these important files. So the reason that we have this set as the default is that it makes it convenient to deploy these files to the server. In fact, as we'll see, when we create a data source in Style Studio and save that data source, which is the connection to your database, for example, when we save that data source, because we're saving it into the very same location that the Style Intelligence server will be looking for the data source definitions, we don't need to do any further deployment step. We can simply save the data source in Style Studio, and it will be available to the server. And the same will hold true for other assets that we save. For example, data worksheets or reports that we save into this particular repository location, which is set up as our default working repository location. All of those assets will be available automatically to our server because we are saving them into this particular location. Now, this does not mean that we always need to use this location. In fact, you can set a different location here, and indeed you can add additional repositories. So perhaps you have multiple servers that you would like to deploy assets to. You can create alternative repositories by pressing the New button here, and perhaps create a repository corresponding to those different servers, and that will allow you then to deploy assets from Style Studio into any of those different server environments. That is not a topic that we're going to go into right now, but for now, I just want you to check that, in fact, your default repository is set to this particular location. Again, it's the location of the Style Intelligence installation folder, which in my case is called C/Style Intelligence Evaluation. Your installation folder may have a slightly different name. And then /server/webapps/sree/webinf/classes. This should be the default setting for this configuration directory. Okay, once you've checked on the repository location, you can press OK to dismiss that dialog box. It will give you a small message here that you can press OK and ignore. And now we can get down to defining a connection to our data source. So let's go ahead and do this. We have a sample installed database, which is a database that contains order information. And what we'll do now is we'll create a connection to that database. To do this, press the New button in the Style Studio toolbar. That opens up the New Asset dialog box. And since we want to create a new data source, click on the Data Source option. And that gives us a set of options here, a set of choices as to what kind of data source we want to create. And the type of data source that we create depends on the nature of our database. The most common data source is called a Jdbc data source, which stands for Java Database Connectivity, and that includes all of the major databases, Oracle, SQL Server, MySQL, DB2 are all Jdbc data sources, meaning that they all provide a Java driver that allows a Java software such as Style Studio and Style Intelligence to connect to that database. The other options here, if you have for example, a Java object data source or a text data source, text file, Excel file, you can set those up as data sources as well by selecting those different options. For this example, though, we're going to proceed to connect to our orders database, and since our orders database is a relational database, it's a Jdbc database, we're going to use the Jdbc option. So select that option, press OK, and that will launch the Jdbc data source wizard, which has a couple of steps that we'll go through to connect to this data source. First of all, we'll give it a name, and we can call the name sample orders. This name is the name under which the data source will appear in the asset listing. So you'll notice that in the asset panel of Style Studio, there's a data source node. In there is a list of all of the currently defined data sources, and when we finish defining this data source, it will appear under that data source node with the name that we provide. You can add a description if you want. this is a sample data source, for example, and then press the next button. On the driver tab, we have to select the Jdbc type, and generally all you need to do here is select the particular type of database that you're connecting to. So if you're using SQL Server, you make the appropriate selection. If you're using Oracle, you would find Oracle in the list and make the appropriate selection. If you're using DB2, find that option in the list, and so on. In our particular case, our sample database is a Derby embedded database, so we'll select the Derby embedded option, and that automatically populates the Jdbc driver entry here. So when you make a selection of your particular data source, the Jdbc driver is automatically populated. In the event that your data source does not fall into any of these categories, and you know that it is a Jdbc data source, you can select the other option, and then you will have to manually enter the Jdbc driver class. Okay, but for our case again, Derby embedded is the database. And then we can press the next button at the bottom, and there are just a few more configuration options we have to specify. The evaluation guide provides some information that will help you fill this out for different types of databases, such as Oracle and DB2. In our case, the correct URL here is jdbc:/derby:/classpath:/orders. In general, you can ask your system administrator, your database administrator, what the correct Jdbc URL is for your database. And your system administrator or your database administrator should be able to provide you this information. Okay, for our database, there is no login required, so we can turn off requires login, and we don't need to specify anything else here. Default DB would allow you to specify a default schema, but again, in our case, that's not necessary. So we can press the test button, and we should receive a message, test is successful. In general, if you receive a failure at this point, in other words, if you try to test the connection to the database, and that connection fails, the two most common causes are that the Jdbc URL is not correct. So that would certainly cause a failure of the test. The other possibility is that the jar file, the Java driver for the database, is not on the Style Studio class path. So I'll illustrate how you can investigate that in just a moment. But hopefully, if you're following along with this example, you would have seen a successful test. Press OK, and then press the Finish button. And we have now created this connection to our database. We haven't saved it yet, but you can see that if you need to make modifications at this point, you can make any modifications. You can change the Jdbc URL if you need to. If you need to specify login information, you can do that. And there are several other options here as well that we're not going to go into right now, but they are all in the documentation. Let's go ahead and save this new data source. And to do that, simply press the Save button in Style Studio. And that saves this data source under the name Sample Orders. And if you expand in the Asset panel the data source node, you'll now see the Sample Orders data source listed along with our other default installed data sources. So there is the Sample Orders data source. And what you should keep in mind is that when you create a data source, what you're doing is creating a connection to a database. We haven't specified any data. We haven't entered any data. All this is a connection to an existing database, an existing Jdbc data source. Now, I mentioned that in the event that you run into a problem, the two most common causes are an error in the Jdbc URL or the absence, the omission of the jar files that contain the Java driver for the database from the class path. So let's see how you would investigate that kind of failure. To do that, you go to the File menu, again back to the Configure option, which opens the Style Studio configuration, and you'll note that one of the tabs there is a class path tab. You can click on that tab, and on that tab, what you need to have somewhere in this list is the jar file that contains the Java driver for your particular database. And every Jdbc database should supply one or more files that fills that role. So whether you're using SQL Server or Oracle, they all provide a jar file, a Java driver, that will allow a Java program such as Style Studio to connect to the database, and that jar file must be on this list. If it's not, then you can press the Add Jar button, and that will open up a file browser, and you can find that jar file and add it to the list. So we've now created a connection to our database with the name sample orders, and we can now go ahead and create assets that draw data from that database via the data source. Those assets can include data worksheets, dashboards, reports, queries, etc. Now, if you make changes to the database connection information here and you wish to, again, test the connection, you can do that. There's a test connection button in the toolbar, the same as we saw in the dialog box previously, and you can at any point press that button to verify that you do have a solid connection to your database.